Caleb was one of the men of great faith in the Old Testament. While others feared challenges, he believed in God's promises. During Israel's long journey toward the Promised Land, Caleb never doubted that the Lord would be on their side. Even in the face of giants and difficulties, his confidence remained unshakable. He knew that God would keep his word, and that gave him the courage to move forward. Her story is a journey of patience, courage, and determination. Before we start, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any content. If you like the story, send a thanks a lot. And to further support our channel, become a member and enjoy exclusive benefits. Caleb advanced silently among the hills of the land that God had promised to Israel. Alongside 11 other men, he spied every detail of the territory that could soon be the people's new home. The mission was clear: explore, observe, and report back on what awaited them. As they approached, the fertile fields and laden vineyards showed that the land truly was good, just as the Lord had said. But then, among the valleys and hills, something else caught the spies' attention. Fortified cities appeared in the distance, their walls imposing and protected by giant-like warriors. The tranquility of the mission was quickly replaced by murmurs of fear among the men. Some began to exchange worried looks, already imagining the difficulties that would come. When they returned to camp, the people's expectations were enormous. Everyone wanted to know what the Promised Land was like. The crowd gathered around them, eager to hear about this place that, for so long, only existed in God's dreams and promises. The spies began to talk. "It's a rich land," they said, their eyes shining. "There are huge fruits, milk and honey everywhere." For a brief moment, hope arose in the hearts of the people. But soon, the tone of the conversation changed. The words began to weigh heavy, like stones falling on the crowd. "But there are giants there," one of the spies said, his voice thick with fear. "Fortified cities, high walls. We would never be able to get in." Suddenly, what seemed like a paradise became a nightmare for most. Panic spread quickly. People began to murmur, and fear, previously hidden, took over everyone. It was as if the land, promised and dreamed of, was now out of reach. At that moment, the irony was clear. Everyone had seen the same miracles from God: the sea parting, manna falling from the sky, protection in battles, but faced with the giants, they forgot everything. For Caleb, however, the story was different. He did not see those giants as the end, but as another obstacle that God would certainly remove. He looked at Joshua, and they both knew. What was before them was not impossible. It was just another test of faith. Chaos began to spread throughout the camp. The words of the spies, which first filled hearts with hope, now created a wave of despair. It was as if the fortified cities and the giants were enormous shadows that hovered over the people, erasing any memory of God's promises. Murmurs echoed everywhere. "Why did we come here? To die at the hands of those giants? We would have been better off staying in Egypt." But Caleb, with his eyes fixed on what he believed, could not accept the fear that dominated the people. He and Joshua were in the midst of that whirlwind of doubts and weaknesses, but they knew they could not allow the crowd to ignore the power of God. Caleb then stepped forward, his strong voice cutting through the dense air. "The land we spy is good. We can take it. The Lord is with us, and he has already given us victory." Still, Caleb's courage was not enough to calm the fears that had gripped the people. The people were blind, trapped in their own limited vision. They forgot the many times the Lord rescued them, and their confidence seemed to evaporate in the face of obstacles. Desperation grew, and now the idea of returning to the desert began to gain strength. The tension in the camp increased by the second. Fear and disbelief spread like a disease, infecting everyone's hearts. In the midst of this, Caleb remained firm, but the situation was becoming unsustainable. The people, now overcome by despair, began to talk about returning to Egypt. The land of the giants, once a distant dream, now seemed like a trap, and the memory of the days of slavery became, ironically, a false security. The panic screams echoed, and in that chaos, the sense of direction disappeared. It was at that moment that Caleb, without wasting time, tried again to bring reason to that crowd. He stood up with a determination that few understood and said firmly, "The Lord has brought us this far, and he is greater than any giant. Fear not, the land is ours." But despite his conviction, Caleb's voice seemed to be lost among the screams and murmurs. The people could not see beyond the walls and the giant men that inhabited the land. Fear had dominated their minds. As Caleb struggled to keep his faith unshakable, he knew something terrible was coming. The disbelief of that moment carried too high a price. God would not ignore the people's rebellion. And deep down, Caleb began to understand that his path would not be as simple as he had imagined. He was sure that the promise still stood, but what he didn't know was how long he would have to wait for it. The desert was no longer just a place of passage, but would become the setting for a long journey, a journey that would test your faith like never before. The verdict came as a severe blow to everyone. The promised land was so close, but because of unbelief, it would be inaccessible to that generation. God, in his justice, decided that none of those who had doubted would enter the promised land. A long road opened before them, and it would not be an easy path. 40 years in the desert, that was the sentence. 40 years of waiting, 40 years of wandering aimlessly, while all who doubted God would perish before crossing the boundaries of the land they so desired. Caleb, however, received a different promise. God saw his heart, the faith that did not waver, even in the face of giants and walls. "You will go in," said the Lord, "and the land on which your feet have trod will be your inheritance." But despite this promise, Caleb would also have to travel through the desert along with the rest of the people. What would have been just a brief crossing turned into a long journey. Year after year, Caleb saw his companions, those who did not believe, succumb to despair and the passage of time. Each morning in the desert was a reminder of the promise that had not yet been fulfilled, but he did not falter. His faith remained firm, despite the tiredness, despite the long wait. He knew that God did not lie, and that at some point, the day would come to take possession of the land. With each step on the hot desert sands, Caleb saw not only the emptiness in front of him, but the promise that was yet to come. The days in the desert seemed endless, but through the scorching heat and cold nights, Caleb remained steadfast. With every step, he kept God's promise in his heart, even when everything around him seemed to make no sense. The people murmured. Some questioned whether they would ever reach the land they had heard so much about. But Caleb, even with the weight of years on his shoulders, kept the flame of hope alive. During these 40 years, he saw many succumb to tiredness, to disillusionment. Faces that once carried ambition and expectation now seemed faded, and the memory of Egypt, however bitter, always returned to the minds of many. But Caleb didn't let himself be shaken. He knew that, despite everything, the desert was not the end. The promised land was still there, waiting for him. Every morning he woke up in the middle of nowhere. He believed he was one step closer to Hebron. The time in the desert was not just a wait, but a test of patience and faith. Caleb observed the new generation that was growing up around him, young people who had not experienced the burden of slavery in Egypt, but who had also not known God's great miracles. He knew that they would be responsible for achieving what their parents had lost. And with each lesson the desert taught them, Caleb prepared himself for the moment when Hebron would finally be his. Now, with the old generation fading and a new one rising, Caleb knew the time was coming. They would soon be on the edge of the promised land again, and he was ready to claim what God had promised him so many years ago. 40 years had passed. The desert, with all its weight and trials, was finally behind us. Now, before the people of Israel, was the land that so many dreamed of, the one that had been promised to their ancestors. For many, it was a fresh start, a chance to achieve a new future. But for Caleb, that moment had an even deeper meaning. He was no longer the young spy who, with shining eyes, first saw Hebron. Now, at age 85, the weight of the years was upon him, but the spirit remained the same. Standing next to Joshua, the new leader of Israel, Caleb looked at the land with a mixture of expectation and remembrance. He had waited so long for this moment, and now it was closer than ever. The battles to conquer the land were being fought, and the people, led by Joshua, were advancing on the fortified cities. But Caleb knew that for him, there was still a personal battle to be won. Among the hills and mountains, Hebron was waiting. The city of giants, the land that promised so much, was still occupied by powerful warriors. However, Caleb was not afraid. He believed as much as ever that God would give him the strength he needed to win, even at his advanced age. His faith was unshakable, and his body, although aged, still carried the disposition of a young man. Caleb, aged 85, approached Joshua with the same confidence he had since the first day he set foot on that land. The memory of Hebron, the city of giants, had never left his mind. Now, after decades in the desert and countless battles won, he knew his moment had come. While others might think about resting, Caleb had other plans. He wanted a mountain, the land where the giants, the feared Anakim, still lived. Caleb approached Joshua with a firm voice, but marked by the weight of years. "Joshua, do you remember what the Lord said to Moses about me? It has been 45 years since we spied the land. I was 40 years old then, and today at 85, I still feel as strong as ever, ready to the battle. So give me the mountain that the Lord promised. I know the giants are still there, but with God by my side, I will overcome them." Joshua heard those words with admiration. He knew that Caleb was not driven by ambition or stubbornness, but by the unshakable faith that always helped him. Accompanied, others around could have their doubts. How could a man his age face a fortified city full of feared warriors? But Caleb did not see giants or insurmountable fortresses. He saw only God's promise and believed that, just as he had waited patiently all these years, now was the time to finally take hold of what he had been promised. With Joshua's blessing, Caleb prepared to face his greatest challenge. The battle for Hebron was about to begin. Caleb, with a heart full of faith and determination, marched towards the mountain of Hebron. That place, which had occupied his dreams for so long, was now within his reach. Many would have given up, fearing the giants that still occupied the land. The Anakites were known for their imposing stature and their reputation as invincible warriors. But to Caleb, they were just another obstacle between him and God's promise. He walked with the same strength and courage as when he was 40, as if the time in the desert had only strengthened his conviction. Every step towards the city was a reminder that he was not fighting in his own strength. Hebron represented more than a simple territorial conquest. It was living proof that God's promises are unchanging, no matter how much time passes or how great the challenge is. As he climbed the hills and saw the city walls in the distance, there was no doubt in his heart. The battle ahead would be arduous, and many doubted he had the strength to face those giants. But Caleb knew that the strength that moved him came not just from his body, but from the divine promise he had carried since he was young. And so, with sword in hand and unshakable faith, he advanced. The sound of battle preparations echoed around him. The eyes of the giants may have been on him, but Caleb's eyes were fixed on something much larger. The war for Hebron was about to begin, and with every step he took, Caleb felt that victory was already assured. Caleb, after defeating the giants and taking Hebron, finally looked at the land that was now his. That mountain, which had been in his thoughts for so many years, was now a reality beneath his feet. Hebron, the place of his promise, was not just conquered territory. It was a living symbol of his perseverance and unshakable faith. Every battle he fought there, every giant he faced, seemed just a distant echo in the face of the certainty that God had fulfilled his word. The city, once dominated by feared warriors, was now a place of peace. The walls, which had previously seemed insurmountable, now sheltered the man who believed against all odds. For many, Hebron could have been the end of the line, a place of rest after a long journey. But for Caleb, it was just another milestone in his story with God. After all, Hebron was not just a promised land. It was a place that told the story of God's faithfulness and faith that never wavered. However, peace was not just for him. Hebron represented a future for the generations that would come after him. Caleb knew that the fight for that territory was not just for him, but for his people, his children, and all those who would inherit the land. He had gained a resting place, but he was also preparing the way for those who would follow your steps. Even after the conquest of Hebron, Caleb's story did not end there. The true legacy he would leave was not just in the lands he had taken, but in the faith he maintained throughout his life. He knew Hebron was more than a personal victory. It was a symbol for the entire people of Israel. Caleb was a living example of what it meant to trust God, even when everything seemed impossible, and he wanted that faith to be passed on. As he looked at the new generation growing up around him, he saw something important. Those young people had not witnessed the miracles in Egypt, nor the crossing of the Red Sea. They had not lived through the years of slavery, nor seen manna come down from heaven. They were about to inherit a land full of promise, but without knowing the pain and battles their parents faced. And that was Caleb's mission now, to make sure they understood what it meant to trust God without reservation. His life was a living reminder that God's promises do not fail, but that they often require patience, courage, and above all, unwavering faith. Caleb wanted his descendants to know that the conquest of Hebron was not just a matter of strength, but of steadfast faith. The real giant he faced was not the enemy on the walls, but the challenge of continuing to believe, even when everyone around him gave up. As Caleb walked through the lands that were now his, he watched the young men preparing for the battles to come. But deep down, he knew that the real battle would not just be against external enemies. Caleb, now 85 years old, understood that these young people's biggest struggle would be against doubt, the uncertainty that arises when the path becomes difficult and the promise seems distant. He had seen this happen to his generation companions, men who, faced with giants, lost confidence and chose disbelief. Caleb wanted these young people to understand that victory does not just come from strength or the number of warriors, but from trust in God. It was this faith that he sought to pass on to them. He began to share his stories, speaking not only of the battles fought on the field, but of the internal struggles he faced in the desert. He told of the nights of waiting, the years of silence, and how, even when all seemed lost, he kept his gaze on the promise. Caleb wanted them to know that God is faithful, but that this faithfulness requires perseverance. The new generation listened attentively, but Caleb knew they would also have to face their own challenges. He could teach them, guide them, but the time would come when they would have to make their own decisions of faith. Caleb knew his time was running out. His days of battle, his victories, his conquests were now in the past. He had fulfilled what God had promised him, but he knew that his greatest legacy would not be the lands of Hebron, but the faith he planted in the hearts of the new generation. That land, full of promises and abundance, would still demand a lot from the people of Israel. Other challenges would come, and Caleb, even as he grew older, understood that the most difficult challenges were not always the visible ones, but the invisible battles that arise in the heart. Caleb's story teaches us several important lessons that we can apply to our lives. Firstly, we see that persevering faith overcomes any obstacle. Caleb believed God's promises, even when everyone around him gave up or became afraid. He faced giants and fortified cities, but his trust in God never wavered, showing us that true faith does not waver in the face of difficulties. Another fundamental lesson is trust in God, even when there is delay. For 45 years, Caleb patiently waited for God's promise to be fulfilled. Many would have lost hope, but he knew that at the right time, the promise would be fulfilled. This teaches us that even if the answer seems to take time, God always acts at the right time. Furthermore, Caleb shows us the power of focusing on God's promise, not on problems. While other spies only saw the dangers, Caleb saw the promised land through faith. He knew that with God, there was no giant too big. It reminds us to look beyond our circumstances, trusting that God is greater than any challenge. His story also reminds us that age does not limit faith or action. Even at 85 years old, Caleb was ready to fight and conquer. This shows us that, regardless of age, we can always trust and act on God's promises. Finally, Caleb's life reveals that the greatest legacy we can leave is not material, but spiritual. His example of faith impacted generations. He teaches us that more than material achievements, the inheritance of a life of trust in God is what really makes a difference. If you like Caleb's story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible